My own daughter looked me straight in the eye and said, "We can't help you anymore, Dad." And the way she said it, calm, cold, like she'd rehearsed it in her head 100 times. That's what broke something inside me that I didn't even know could still break. She didn't yell, didn't cry, didn't slam a door or throw her hands up in frustration like people do when they're angry but still care. She just looked tired, like I was this weight she'd been carrying for too long and finally decided to put down. I packed my bags that same night, slow and quiet, folding the same shirts I'd worn for years, and I didn't say a word, because what do you say when your own child treats you like a burden they can't afford anymore? Days later, when she saw my bank account, her face went pale, completely pale, like the foundation she'd been standing on just cracked wide open beneath her feet, and that's when everything changed. Let me back up a little, because you need to understand how I got here, and I'm sure you'll be surprised and moved. So, click the subscribe button below so you don't miss any of the true stories about justice and family betrayal that we bring you daily. My name's Richard. I'm 74 years old, and up until 6 months ago, I thought I knew what family meant. I've lived a quiet life, the kind most people don't write stories about. Worked hard, saved what I could, loved my wife Margaret for 47 years until her heart just gave out. Natural causes, the doctor said. Like that makes it easier to swallow. She passed 2 years ago, and when she did, it felt like the glue holding everything together just dissolved. Margaret was the one who kept the family close, who remembered birthdays, who called our daughter every Sunday no matter what. Without her, I realized I didn't really know how to do that anymore. My daughter, Emily, she's 49 now, married to a man named Derek. Got 2 teenage boys who barely look up from their phones when I walk into a room. After Margaret died, Emily insisted I come stay with them for a while, just until I got back on my feet, she said. I didn't want to be a burden, but the house felt so empty without Margaret that I said yes. I thought maybe it'd be good for all of us, you know, spend time together, help out where I could, be the grandfather those boys needed. But here's the thing about getting old that nobody tells you when you're young. You start feeling like you need permission just to exist. You apologize for breathing too loud, for leaving a light on, for taking up space in a world that's already moved on without you. Emily's a good person. I want you to know that. She works full-time as a hospital administrator, comes home exhausted, barely has time to cook dinner before she's answering emails again. Derek's in sales, always on the road, always stressed about quotas and commissions and things I don't fully understand. The boys are wrapped up in school and sports and whatever teenagers do these days. I get it. They're busy. Life's busy. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being dad and started being an inconvenience, a problem they didn't have time to solve. I'd try to help around the house, do the dishes, fold laundry, but Emily would sigh and say, "Dad, you don't have to do that," in this tone that really meant, "You're doing it wrong." I'd offer to cook dinner, and she'd say, "It's fine, we'll just order something," like my cooking wasn't good enough anymore. The worst part wasn't the big moments, it was the little ones. The way Derek would glance at Emily when I asked for a ride to the doctor. The way Emily would pause, just a second too long, before saying yes when I needed to refill a prescription. The way they'd talk about money in front of me, like I wasn't even there. "This mortgage is killing us," Derek would say, "and with everything else we're paying for," he'd trail off. But I knew what everything else meant. It meant me, my medications, my groceries, the extra water bill because I still take long showers like Margaret and I used to. I started keeping track of every little thing I used, every light I turned on, every bite of food I took from their fridge. I felt like a guest who'd overstayed their welcome in a house that was supposed to feel like home. I tried to bring it up once, real gentle-like. I said, "Emily, honey, if it's too much having me here, I can find a little place in town. Just a room somewhere, nothing fancy. I don't need much." She looked at me with this mix of guilt and exhaustion and said, "Dad, don't be ridiculous. You're not going anywhere." But the way she said it didn't feel like love. It felt like obligation. Like she was doing what she was supposed to do, not what she wanted to do. And that's when I realized something that cut deeper than any word she could have said. I wasn't her father anymore. I was a responsibility, a line item in her budget, a burden she carried because society said she had to, not because her heart wanted to. And once you feel that, once you know that the people you love see you as a weight instead of a person, man, it changes everything. I started spending more time in my room, staying out of the way, trying to make myself as small as possible. I'd hear them laughing downstairs, and I wouldn't go join them because I didn't want to kill the mood. I'd skip meals so there'd be more food for the boys. I'd pretend I didn't need things I actually needed because I didn't want to ask. And the crazy thing, the more invisible I made myself, the more they seemed relieved, like I was finally learning my place in their lives. But here's what they didn't know, what nobody knew, because I never talked about it, never flaunted it, never used it as leverage. I wasn't the broke old man they thought I was. Not even close. I had money, more than they could imagine, saved and invested over decades of living below my means. But I never wanted to be needed because of my bank account. I wanted to be loved despite my age. I wanted to matter because I was their father, not because I could pay for things. And that's the test I was running, whether I meant to or not. A test that, in the end, they failed. You know what's funny about family betrayal? It doesn't happen all at once, like in the movies where someone screams and slams a door, and you know exactly when everything fell apart. No, it happens slow, like rust eating through metal you can't even see until one day the whole thing just collapses. It started with little comments, the kind you could almost ignore if you wanted to lie to yourself. Emily would walk past my room and see the light on and say, "Dad, you left the light on again." And I'd apologize even though I was still in the room, still using it. Derek would mention the electric bill at dinner, real casual-like, saying, "Man, it's crazy how high it's getting." And then he'd glance at me, just for a second. But I caught it. I always caught it. And every time, I'd feel smaller, like I was shrinking into myself, trying to take up less space, less air, less life in a house that used to feel like it had room for me. Then there were the medications. I've got a heart condition, nothing too serious, but I need my pills every day or things get dicey real fast. One afternoon, I asked Emily if she could pick up my refill on her way home from work, and she sighed. This deep, exhausted sigh like I'd just asked her to climb a mountain, and said, "Dad, do you know how expensive these are? I mean, we're doing what we can, but..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I told her I'd figure it out myself, maybe take the bus to the pharmacy, and she said, No, I'll get it." But her voice had this edge to it, this resentment that sat between us like a wall I couldn't climb over. After that, I started rationing my pills, skipping doses here and there, telling myself I'd be fine, because I didn't want to be the reason they couldn't pay for something else, something more important, like new cleats for one of the boys, or a weekend trip they'd been planning. The worst part, though, was the conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. I've got decent hearing for a man my age, and their bedroom was right above mine, so at night when the house got quiet, I'd hear them talking, Emily and Derek, going over finances, talking about credit card debt, about the mortgage, about how tight things were, and then Derek said it, clear as day, "We can't keep doing this. He's bleeding us dry." Emily didn't argue. She didn't defend me. She just said, "I know. I don't know what to do." And I laid there in that bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like I'd been gutted. Because when you hear your own child say they don't know what to do with you, when you become a problem that needs solving instead of a person who needs love, something inside you just breaks. You start to believe it. You start to think, maybe they're right. Maybe you are too much. Maybe the world would be better if you just disappeared. I tried one more time to offer a way out. I sat Emily down one morning when Derek was at work and the boys were at school. And I said, "Honey, I've been thinking, maybe it's time I find my own place. Just a small room somewhere in town, nothing fancy. I can take care of myself. I don't need much." She looked at me with this mix of relief and guilt, and for a second I thought she was going to say yes. Thought she was finally gonna let me go with some dignity intact. But then she shook her head and said, "Dad, you can't afford that. You're on a fixed income. Where would you even go?" And I almost told her right then. I almost said, "Emily, I've got more money than you think. I'm not broke. I'm not helpless." But I didn't, because I wanted to see if she'd fight for me without the money. I wanted to know if I mattered to her as a father, not as a wallet. And her answer, whether she knew it or not, was no. The days started blending together after that. I'd wake up early, make my own coffee, sit in my room, and try not to exist too loudly. I stopped joining them for meals unless they specifically asked, which they rarely did. I stopped watching TV in the living room because I didn't want to be in the way. I stopped talking about my day because nobody asked. And the thing about being treated like a burden is that eventually, you start to feel like one. You start to believe that your presence is a problem, that your age is a crime, that the love you gave for decades doesn't count anymore because you can't give the same way you used to. I'd look at old photos of Emily as a little girl, sitting on my shoulders, laughing, holding my hand, and I'd wonder where that person went. I'd wonder when I stopped being her hero and started being her liability. And I'd think about Margaret, about how she'd know exactly what to say, how to fix this. But she wasn't here anymore, and I was alone in a house full of people who wished I wasn't there. But here's the thing they didn't know, the thing nobody knew, because I'd spent my whole life being humble, being quiet, never flaunting what I had. I wasn't stuck. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't the helpless old man they thought I was. I had options. I had resources, I had a foundation they couldn't even see, and I was about to find out just how much they valued me when the money wasn't on the table, because the truth has a way of surfacing, whether you want it to or not. And when it did, when that moment came and everything I'd been hiding was laid bare in front of them, the look on Emily's face would tell me everything I needed to know about what I really meant to her. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, I had to hear the words that would change everything. The words that would make me pack those bags and walk out that door for good. It happened on a Tuesday night, which is funny because Tuesdays are supposed to be boring, uneventful, the kind of day that just passes without leaving a mark. But this Tuesday, this one burned itself into my memory so deep I can still feel the heat of it. Emily came home late from work, already stressed, already wound tight like a spring about to snap. Derek was in the kitchen going through bills, and I could hear him muttering under his breath, shuffling papers, sighing every few seconds like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. I was in my room, door cracked open just enough to hear, and I had this sinking feeling in my gut, the kind you get right before something bad happens and you can't stop it. They started talking, voices low at first, but then Emily's voice got sharper, louder, and I heard my name. "We can't keep doing this," she said. "Something has to change." Derek agreed. Of course he did. And they went back and forth for a while, talking about money, about stress, about how they were stretched too thin and couldn't see a way out. And then Emily said she needed to talk to me, needed to be honest with me, and I knew right then that whatever was coming wasn't going to be good. She knocked on my door, didn't wait for me to answer, just walked in and stood there with her arms crossed, looking at me like I was some kind of problem she'd been avoiding for too long. "Dad, we need to talk," she said, and I nodded, told her to sit down, but she didn't. She stayed standing, kept that distance between us, and that's when I knew this wasn't a conversation. This was a verdict. She took a deep breath, looked me right in the eye, and said, "We can't help you anymore." Just like that. Cold, final. Like she'd been practicing it in her head and finally worked up the nerve to say it out loud. I didn't say anything at first because honestly, what do you say to that? I just sat there, hands folded in my lap, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. She kept talking, filling the silence with justifications, with reasons that were supposed to make it okay. She talked about the mortgage, about the boys, college funds, about Derek's job being unstable, about how they were drowning in debt and couldn't afford to take care of me anymore. "It's not that we don't love you, Dad," she said, and I almost laughed at that because if this was love, I didn't want it. "It's just, we have to think about our future. We have to think about our kids. And there it was, the real message underneath all the words. I wasn't part of their future. I was a weight dragging them down, an expense they couldn't justify, a problem that needed to be cut loose so they could move on with their lives. She waited for me to argue, I think. Waited for me to beg or cry or ask her to reconsider. But I didn't give her that. I just nodded, slow and steady, and said, I understand. And I did. I understood perfectly. I understood that in her mind, I'd stopped being her father and started being a financial burden she couldn't carry anymore. I understood that all the years I spent raising her, all the sacrifices Margaret and I made to give her a good life, all the love we poured into her, it didn't matter now because love doesn't pay bills and memories don't cover mortgages. She looked almost relieved when I didn't fight back, like she'd been bracing for a battle and was grateful I surrendered without one. And I'll start looking for a place, I told her, and she nodded. Said something about how we'd figure it out together, how she'd help me find somewhere affordable. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was already gone. After she left, I just sat there in the dark for a long time, letting it all sink in. The humiliation, the rejection, the quiet, brutal realization that I'd been reduced to a line item in a budget, a problem to be solved, a burden to be lifted. I thought about all the times I'd held Emily when she was scared, all the nights I stayed up when she was sick, all the ways I showed up for her when she needed me. And I wondered if any of it mattered now. I wondered if she even remembered. Or maybe she did remember, and it just wasn't enough. Maybe in her mind, I'd already taken more than I'd given, and now it was time to balance the scales. I wasn't angry, not really. I was just tired. Tired of apologizing for existing. Tired of making myself small. Tired of hoping that one day she'd look at me and see her father instead of a problem. And that's when I made the decision. I wasn't going to wait for her to find me some cheap room somewhere. Wasn't going to let her manage my exit like I was a piece of furniture she was donating. I was going to leave on my own terms, with my dignity intact, and I was going to do it quietly, the same way I'd lived my whole life. But what she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the part where everything she thought she knew about me turned out to be wrong. I started packing that same night. Didn't wait for morning. Didn't wait for Emily to change her mind or soften the blow with some half-hearted apology. I pulled out the old suitcase Margaret and I used to take on road trips, the one with the scuffed corners and the broken zipper I never got around to fixing, and I laid it open on the bed. It didn't take long because I didn't have much. A few shirts, a couple pairs of pants, socks that had seen better days. My medications lined up in their little orange bottles. I folded everything slow and careful, the way Margaret taught me, because even when your world's falling apart, some habits just stick. I packed the photo album, the one with pictures of Emily as a little girl, smiling with missing teeth, holding my hand at the park, sitting on my lap at Christmas. I don't know why I took it. Maybe I wanted to remember who she used to be before I became a burden. Maybe I just needed proof that I mattered once. The house was quiet, everyone already asleep, and I moved through the rooms like a ghost, checking to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. I stood in the doorway of the living room for a minute, looking at the couch where I used to sit with Margaret, the TV we'd watched together, the family photos on the wall that didn't feel like my family anymore. I thought about leaving a note, something to explain, something to make them understand. But what was there to say? Thanks for the memories. Sorry I was such a burden? No, I wasn't going to give them that. I wasn't going to make this easier for them by pretending it was okay. So I just closed the door to my room, left the key on the dresser, and walked out into the night with my suitcase in one hand and my dignity in the other. Nobody came to say goodbye. Nobody woke up to ask where I was going. And that told me everything I needed to know. I took a cab to a small motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where they don't ask questions and you pay by the week. The room was clean enough, single bed, tiny bathroom, a window that looked out onto the parking lot, and I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time, just staring at the walls, trying to figure out how I'd gotten here. 74 years old, sitting alone in a motel room because my own daughter couldn't stand to have me around anymore. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart and not my own. But it was real. The scratchy bedspread under my hands was real. The hum of the air conditioner was real. The ache in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition, that was real too. I thought about calling Emily, thought about telling her where I was, but I didn't. Let her wake up and find me gone. Let her wonder. Let her feel, just for a moment, what it's like to lose someone without warning. The next morning I found a small apartment in the center of town, nothing fancy. Just a one-bedroom on the second floor of an old building with creaky stairs and thin walls. The landlord was an older guy, didn't care that I was paying in cash, didn't ask for references or a credit check, just handed me the keys and told me rent was due on the 1st. I moved in that same day, unpacked my suitcase, put Margaret's photo on the nightstand, and tried to build some kind of life out of the pieces I had left. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet. And at night I'd lie awake, listening to the sounds of the city outside. Cars passing, people talking, life moving on without me. I kept my routine simple. Coffee in the morning, a walk to the corner store for groceries, lunch at the diner down the street where the waitress knew my order by the 3rd day. I didn't need much. I never did. But what I needed, what I'd always needed, wasn't money or comfort or a fancy place to live. I needed to be seen. I needed to matter. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I was going to have to matter to myself first, because nobody else was going to do it for me. Emily didn't call. Not that day. Not the next. Not the day after that. A week went by, then 2, and my phone stayed silent. I'd check it sometimes, just to make sure it was still working, and it was. No missed calls, no texts, nothing. And that silence said more than any words ever could. It said I'd been right all along. I wasn't her father anymore. I was a problem she'd finally solved, a weight she'd finally put down. And now that I was gone, she could breathe easier. Part of me wanted to be angry, wanted to call her up and tell her exactly what I thought of her and Derek and their precious little life that didn't have room for me. But I didn't, because anger takes energy, and I didn't have much left to spare. So I just let it go, let her go, let the whole thing go. And I focused on the one thing I could control, myself, my peace, my dignity, the life I was going to build, small as it was, without needing anyone's permission to exist. But here's the thing about the truth. It doesn't stay buried forever. And the truth about who I really was, about what I really had, was about to surface in a way none of us expected. And when it did, when Emily finally saw what she'd walked away from, the foundation she'd been standing on was going to crack wide open. The first week in that apartment felt like living in a different world, one where time moved slower and the air felt heavier, like I was underwater and everything was muffled and distant. I'd wake up each morning, make my coffee, and sit by the window watching people walk by. Young couples holding hands, parents pushing strollers, old friends laughing together. And I'd wonder if any of them knew what it felt like to be invisible. Because that's what I was now. Invisible. Not just to Emily, but to the world. Nobody knew where I was. Nobody checked in. Nobody cared. And the strangest part was how quickly I got used to it. How the silence that used to scare me started feeling like the only honest thing left in my life. At least silence doesn't pretend to care. At least silence doesn't make promises it can't keep. I kept my phone on the kitchen counter, face up, volume all the way up, just in case. Just in case Emily called. Just in case she realized what she'd done and wanted to make it right. But days turned into weeks, and that phone just sat there, silent as a stone. I built myself a routine because routines keep you sane when everything else is falling apart. Mornings, I'd walk to the corner diner, order the same breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, black coffee, and sit in the same booth by the window. The waitress, Linda, she was probably in her 60s, kind eyes, always had a smile even when she looked tired. She started recognizing me after the 3rd day, didn't ask questions, just poured my coffee and let me be. Sometimes I'd bring a newspaper, pretend to read it, but mostly I just watched people. Watched them live their lives, talk to each other, laugh, argue, exist in ways I didn't anymore. Afternoons I'd walk through the park, sit on a bench, feed the pigeons even though the sign said not to. Evenings I'd go back to the apartment, heat up something simple for dinner, and sit in the quiet until it was time to sleep. It wasn't much of a life, but it was mine. Nobody telling me I was too much. Nobody sighing when I asked for something. Nobody making me feel like I had to apologize for breathing. And honestly, that felt like freedom, even if it was the loneliest freedom I'd ever known. But here's what nobody tells you about being alone. It gives you time to think. Too much time, maybe. I'd lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, and I'd replay everything in my head. Every conversation with Emily, every look Derek gave me, every moment I felt small. And I'd ask myself the same question over and over. Did I do something wrong? Was I really that much of a burden? Or was this about something else? Something deeper? Something that had nothing to do with money or space or inconvenience? Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about me being old or needing help. This was about value, about whether I still had any. And in Emily's eyes, in Derek's eyes, I didn't. I'd become disposable, a problem solved by distance. And the worst part wasn't that they thought that. It was that I'd almost started believing it too. Almost, but not quite. Because somewhere deep down, underneath all the hurt and humiliation, there was still a part of me that knew my worth. A part that remembered who I was before I became someone's burden. I didn't reach out to Emily. I could have called, sent a text, shown up at the house and demanded an explanation or an apology, or at least some acknowledgement that I existed. But I didn't, because I wanted to see how long it would take. I wanted to see if she'd notice I was gone, if she'd wonder where I was, if she'd feel even a fraction of the emptiness I felt when she told me she couldn't help me anymore. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks stretched toward a month, the answer became clear. She didn't care. Or if she did, it wasn't enough to pick up the phone. And that told me everything I needed to know about what I meant to her. I wasn't her father. I was a chapter she'd closed, a problem she'd solved, a weight she'd finally put down. And maybe that should have broken me. Maybe I should have crumbled under the weight of that realization. But I didn't, because I'd spent my whole life being underestimated, being overlooked, being treated like I was less than I was. And I was done with that, done apologizing, done shrinking, done pretending I needed them more than they needed me. What Emily didn't know, what she couldn't have known because I never told her, was that I wasn't helpless, I wasn't broke. I wasn't the fragile old man she thought she was rescuing by letting me stay in her house. I had resources. I had options. I had a foundation built over decades of hard work and careful planning. A foundation she never saw because I never flaunted it, never used it as leverage, never made it about the money. I wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I had. I wanted to matter because I was her father, not because I could pay for things. And that was the test. Whether I meant it to be or not. A test of character. A test of love. A test she failed the moment she looked me in the eye and said she couldn't help me anymore. But the truth has a way of coming out, doesn't it? It doesn't stay buried forever. And soon, very soon, something was going to happen that would pull back the curtain on everything I'd been hiding. Something that would force Emily to see me not as a burden, but as someone she'd completely misunderstood. And when that moment came, when she finally saw the full picture, the look on her face would tell me everything I needed to know about what kind of person she'd become. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. First, there was the letter, the one I didn't want to open, the one that changed everything. It started with a letter, plain white envelope, no return address, just my name typed on the front in that cold, impersonal font banks use when they want you to know this is business. Not personal. It showed up at my apartment on a Thursday morning, slipped under the door while I was out getting coffee, and when I saw it sitting there on the floor, I almost didn't pick it up. Because letters like that, they're never good news. They're either telling you you owe something, or you forgot something, or you need to do something you don't want to do. But I picked it up anyway, tore it open standing right there in the hallway, and read the first line. Dear Mr. Richard Patterson, this is a courtesy notice regarding your account ending in 4782. Due to recent regulatory changes, we require updated beneficiary information and your physical presence to verify certain holdings. That word sat heavy in my chest because I knew what it meant, knew what they were really asking for, and I knew this wasn't something I could ignore or handle over the phone. So I called the bank, spoke to some woman named Jennifer who sounded too young to understand what 74 years of saving looks like, and she confirmed what I already knew. I had to come in, had to bring documentation, had to update my beneficiary information because the account was flagged for estate planning purposes. And just to clarify, Mr. Patterson, she said, her voice dropping to that tone people use when they're about to say something they think is impressive. Given the size of your portfolio, we'll need to schedule this with one of our senior advisors. Portfolio. Another word that felt too big for the tiny apartment I was living in. Too big for the life I'd been living. Too big for the man Emily thought I was. I scheduled the appointment for the following Tuesday, hung up the phone, and sat there for a long time just staring at the wall, knowing that this simple, bureaucratic errand was about to crack open everything I'd been keeping hidden. Because the bank required a secondary contact for accounts over a certain threshold, and the only name I had on file was Emily's, my daughter, the one who hadn't called in over a month, the one who told me she couldn't help me anymore. I thought about changing it, about putting someone else's name down, but who? I didn't have anyone else. Margaret was gone. I didn't have siblings. My friends from work had either moved away or passed on. Emily was it, so I called her. First time in 5 weeks. My hands shook as I dialed, and when she answered, her voice was cautious, guarded, like she wasn't sure if she wanted to talk to me or not. "Dad," she said, and I could hear the surprise, maybe a little guilt, but not enough. Never enough. I kept it short, kept it simple, told her the bank needed both of us there to update some paperwork. Nothing major, just a formality. She hesitated, asked why, and I said it was just standard procedure for joint accounts, which wasn't exactly a lie but wasn't the whole truth either. She agreed, reluctantly, said she could meet me there Tuesday at 2, and I thanked her and hung up before the conversation could go anywhere deeper, because I wasn't ready for that yet. Wasn't ready to hear her excuses or her justifications or her half-hearted apologies. I just needed her there, needed her to see, needed her to understand what she'd walked away from. Tuesday came slow and fast at the same time, the way important days always do, and I got to the bank early. Sat in the lobby on one of those stiff leather chairs that are supposed to look expensive but just feel uncomfortable. Emily showed up exactly at 2, dressed in her work clothes, looking tired and distracted, and she gave me this tight little smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hey, Dad," she said, and I nodded. Didn't hug her, didn't pretend everything was fine, just stood up and followed the advisor, a man in his 50s named Mr. Carlson, into a private office with glass walls and a desk so clean it looked like nobody actually worked there. He shook our hands, offered us water, made small talk about the weather, and then he opened his laptop and pulled up my account, and that's when everything changed. I watched Emily's face as Mr. Carlson turned the screen toward us, watched her eyes scan the numbers, watched her expression shift from polite interest to confusion, to shock, to something I can only describe as pale, bloodless, like all the color just drained right out of her. "As you can see, Mr. Patterson," Carlson said, completely oblivious to the bomb he'd just dropped, "your portfolio has performed exceptionally well over the past decade. Between your retirement accounts, your investment holdings, and your savings, you're currently sitting at just over $2.3 million. He said it so casually, like he was talking about the weather. Like that number didn't just shatter every assumption Emily had about me. She didn't say anything, couldn't say anything. Just stared at that screen, her mouth slightly open, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair like she was trying to keep herself from falling. And I just sat there, calm, quiet, watching her process it, watching her realize that the broke old man she'd kicked out, the burden she couldn't afford to help anymore, the father she'd discarded like yesterday's trash, he didn't need her help. He never did. She finally looked at me, her eyes wide and wet, and whispered, "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" And I looked right back at her, my voice steady, my heart breaking, and said, "Because I didn't want to be needed for my money, Emily. I wanted to be loved despite my age." The silence in that office was so thick you could have cut it with a knife, and Mr. Carlson, bless him, he sensed the tension and excused himself, said he'd give us a few minutes to talk privately, and closed the door behind him. Emily just sat there, staring at me like she was seeing a stranger, like the man in front of her wasn't the same person she'd told to leave 5 weeks ago. Her hands were shaking, her eyes were red, and when she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "Dad, I don't understand. You had all this money, and you let me think you were broke. Why?" And I took a deep breath, because this was the moment I'd been dreading and waiting for at the same time. The moment where I had to explain something that shouldn't need explaining. "Because, Emily," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "I didn't want to be necessary because of what I had. I wanted to be wanted because of who I was. I wanted to know if I still mattered to you as your father, not as a wallet you could open when things got tight." She started crying then, really crying, the kind of tears that come from shame and regret, and the sudden, crushing realization that you've made a mistake you can't take back. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, over and over, like if she said it enough times it would undo what she'd done, would erase the words she'd said, would bring back the 5 weeks I'd spent alone in that apartment, wondering if my own daughter cared whether I was alive or dead. I didn't know, Dad. No. I thought we were struggling, and I thought you needed us, and I'm so sorry. And part of me wanted to forgive her right then, wanted to pull her into a hug and tell her it was okay, that we'd figure it out, that family means you get second chances. But the other part of me, the part that had been humiliated and discarded and treated like a burden, that part wasn't ready to let it go so easily. "You didn't think I needed you, Emily," I said, my voice steady, even though my heart was breaking. "You thought I was costing you too much. There's a difference." She tried to explain, tried to justify it, talked about the stress and the bills and how Derek had been pushing her, how she felt trapped between taking care of me and taking care of her own family. And I listened. I really did. But none of it changed the fundamental truth. When it came down to it, when she had to choose between her comfort and my dignity, she chose herself. And I couldn't unhear the words she'd said that night, couldn't unsee the look on her face when she told me she couldn't help me anymore. But here's the thing about family betrayal. It doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something different, something more honest, something built on truth instead of obligation. So I told her the truth, all of it.
Told her I'd been saving and investing for decades, living below my means, never flaunting it because Margaret and I believed in humility, in quiet strength, in not measuring your worth by the size of your bank account. Told her I'd chosen to live simply in her house, not because I had to, but because I wanted to be close to her, wanted to be part of her life, wanted to matter in a way that had nothing to do with money.
"I could have told you any time," I said, watching her face as the full weight of it sank in. "I could have written you a check, could have paid off your mortgage, could have made all your problems disappear with a signature. But I didn't want that. I didn't want you to keep me around because I was useful. I wanted you to keep me around because I was your father." And that's when she really broke, when the tears turned into sobs, and she put her head in her hands and said, "What have I done?" Over and over like a prayer she didn't know how to finish. And I sat there, watching my daughter fall apart, feeling a mix of vindication and sorrow because this wasn't the revenge I wanted. I didn't want her to suffer. I just wanted her to see me, to really see me. Not as a burden or a bank account, but as a person who loved her, who'd always loved her, who would have given her everything if she'd just asked with respect instead of resentment. We left the bank together that day, walked out into the afternoon sun, and she asked if we could talk. Really talk? Maybe get coffee or lunch or just sit somewhere and figure out what came next. And I said yes. Not because I'd forgiven her completely, not because the hurt had magically disappeared, but because she's still my daughter, and despite everything, I still love her. We're rebuilding now, slowly, carefully, with new boundaries and new honesty and a new understanding of what family actually means. She knows now that I don't need her money or her house or her charity. What I need is her respect, her time, her love that isn't conditional on how convenient I am. And she's trying, really trying, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can ask for, a second chance to get it right. Because being a burden, it's not about money or space or how much you cost someone. It's about when love turns into obligation, when presence turns into inconvenience, when the people who are supposed to protect you start seeing you as a problem to solve instead of a person to cherish. So let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. Have you ever been treated like a burden by the people who were supposed to love you? Have you ever felt like you had to apologize for existing, for getting older, for needing help? Have you ever been discarded by someone you gave everything to? If you have, I want you to know you're not alone. Your worth isn't measured by what you can give or how little space you take up or whether you're convenient enough to keep around. You matter. You've always mattered. And if the people in your life can't see that, maybe it's time to show them who you really are. If this story hit home for you, if you felt something while listening, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment below telling me your story. Because these stories, these revenge stories about family betrayal, about standing up for yourself when everyone counted you out, they need to be told. And I want to hear yours. Thanks for listening. And remember, you're never too old to reclaim your dignity.